She thought leaving his wife would set him free. Instead, it killed him in 48 hours. When police arrived at the studio apartment on Berkshire Street, they found David Mitchell's body on a stained futon, his skin already cold to the touch. Empty energy drink cans littered the floor. Fast food wrappers covered the coffee table. The air smelled like stale cigarettes and something chemical the officers couldn't quite place. The apartment belonged to a 19-year-old woman named Sienna Hart, and she was hysterical, pacing in circles, mascara streaking down her face. She kept saying the same thing over and over. He just stopped breathing. I woke up and he wasn't moving. I don't know what happened. I swear I don't know. The paramedics had pronounced him dead at the scene 20 minutes earlier. No signs of violence, not obvious cause. Just a 34-year-old man who had gone to sleep and never woken up. The lead detective, a woman named Torres with 20 years on the job, walked through the cramped space taking mental notes. This wasn't David Mitchell's apartment. His driver's license listed an address in Fairfield, a nice suburb 40 minutes away, a place with a lawn and a 2-car garage. So what was he doing here, in this tiny studio that smelled like decay, dead on a futon that looked like it had been pulled from a dumpster? Torres asked Sienna how long David had been staying with her. 2 days, Sienna said. Just 2 days. He had left his wife and moved in with her because they were in love, because they were going to start a life together. She said it like she believed it, but she couldn't understand why the universe would be so cruel as to take him away just when their future was beginning. Torres exchanged a glance with her partner. 2 days. The man had been here for 2 days, and now he was dead. They bagged the body and took Sienna down to the station for questioning. The real investigation was just beginning. But to understand how David Mitchell ended up dead in that apartment, you have to rewind 2 weeks. Back to when he was still living in his house in Fairfield with his wife Claire and their 6-year-old daughter Emma. Back to when his life still looked normal from the outside. David was the kind of man people described as dependable. He worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, the kind of job that paid well but never felt exciting. He wore khakis and button-down shirts. He mowed the lawn on Saturdays. He coached Emma's soccer team, even though he didn't know much about soccer. His marriage to Claire had settled into the comfortable monotony that most marriages do after 8 years. They didn't fight much. They didn't laugh much either. They coexisted. But lately, David had been feeling something he couldn't name. A restlessness. A sense that time was running out. That he was 34 and his life already felt over. He'd married Claire when he was 25, right out of college, because it seemed like the thing to do. She was pretty and kind, and their families liked each other. They had Emma a year later, and suddenly David was a father, a husband, a man with a mortgage. He'd skipped the part of his 20s where he was supposed to figure out who he was, and now, staring down the barrel of middle age, he felt cheated. He started working out obsessively, spending an hour at the gym every morning before work. He bought new clothes, tighter shirts that showed off the muscle he was building. He changed his hairstyle, traded his sensible sedan for a used BMW he couldn't quite afford. Claire noticed but didn't say much. She figured it was a midlife crisis, the kind of thing men went through when they realized they weren't young anymore. She thought it would pass. She didn't know he'd downloaded a dating app and was swiping through profiles late at night when she was asleep. That's how he found Sienna. Or maybe she found him. Her profile picture showed a young woman with long dark hair and full lips, wearing a college sweatshirt and smiling at the camera like she had a secret. Her bio said she was 19, a freshman studying art, looking for someone real in a world full of fake people. David stared at that photo longer than he should have. She was young enough to be his daughter almost, but there was something in her smile that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in years. He didn't message her first. He was too scared. But she messaged him. It was late, past midnight, and David was lying in bed next to Claire scrolling through his phone. The message popped up. "You don't look like you belong on here. You seem too real for this app." David's heart kicked in his chest. He glanced at Claire, asleep and facing away from him, then typed back, "What makes you say that?" The conversation started like that. Casual, flirtatious, harmless. But within 2 days, they were texting constantly. Sienna had a way of making him feel like he was the most interesting person she'd ever met. She asked questions about his life, his work, his dreams. She told him he seemed different from other men, more mature, more thoughtful. "Most guys my age are such children," she wrote. "They don't know how to treat a woman. But you're different, I can tell." David knew it was wrong. He knew he was married, that he had a daughter, that he was texting a teenager young enough to be in his daughter's classroom in 12 years. But he didn't stop, because for the first time in a decade, he felt alive. Sienna made him feel like he mattered, like he wasn't just a cog in a machine, a paycheck and a lawnmower and a man slowly disappearing into suburban invisibility. She made him feel dangerous, desirable, young. They escalated quickly. Within a week, they were meeting in person. David told Claire he had a client dinner and drove an hour to a hotel near Sienna's college campus. She showed up wearing ripped jeans and a cropped sweater, looking even younger in person than she had in her photos. David felt a flicker of guilt, a voice in his head telling him to turn around and go home. But then she smiled at him, really smiled, and took his hand, and the guilt evaporated. They spent 3 hours in that hotel room, and David left feeling like he'd been reborn, like he'd finally woken up from a long, suffocating sleep. After that, they saw each other whenever they could. David lied constantly. Late meetings, client emergencies, a work trip that didn't exist. Claire didn't question it. She trusted him. Or maybe she just didn't want to know. Sienna started talking about the future almost immediately. She said she'd never met anyone like him, someone who really understood her. She told him about her childhood, how her father had abandoned the family when she was 12, how her mother worked 2 jobs and was never home. She said she'd struggled with depression and anxiety her whole life. The most days she felt invisible. But with David, she felt real. She felt loved. David started to believe they had something genuine, that this wasn't just an affair, it was a connection. Sienna told him age didn't matter, that numbers were just social constructs designed to keep people apart. She said she wanted to build a life with him, a real life, not some secret hidden in hotel rooms. But that meant David had to make a choice. He couldn't have both. He couldn't have his wife and his fantasy. Sienna made that clear one night when they were lying in bed in another anonymous hotel. "I can't keep being a secret," she said, her voice soft but firm. "If you really love me, you'll choose me. Prove it." David went home that night and stared at Claire sleeping next to him. He thought about their daughter, about the life they'd built, about the promises he'd made. But those promises felt like chains now, and Sienna felt like freedom. The next morning, he told Claire he was leaving. She didn't understand at first. She thought he meant he was going on a business trip. But then he started packing a suitcase, pulling clothes from the closet, and she realized he meant leaving forever. Claire begged. She cried. She asked if there was someone else, and David lied, said no, said he just needed space to figure things out. She asked him to think about Emma, about what this would do to their daughter. David said he was thinking about Emma, that he'd be a better father if he was happy, that staying in a marriage he didn't want would only hurt everyone in the long run. It was the kind of logic people used to justify the unjustifiable. Claire stood in the doorway of their bedroom watching him pack, her face pale and disbelieving, and asked him one last question. "Who are you? Because you're not the man I married." David didn't have an answer. He just picked up his suitcase and walked out. He moved into a motel for 2 nights, the kind of place with stained carpets and a neon sign that flickered. He texted Sienna telling her he'd done it, he'd left, he'd chosen her. She responded with heart emojis and said she couldn't wait to start their life together. "Come stay with me," she wrote. "My apartment isn't much, but it's ours now." David ignored the voice in his head that said this was insane, that he barely knew this girl, that he'd just destroyed his family for someone he'd met 3 weeks ago. He packed his suitcase again and drove to Sienna's address, a rundown building on the east side of town where the paint was peeling and the hallway smelled like mildew. Her apartment was worse than he'd imagined. A studio barely big enough for one person, with a futon shoved against one wall and a kitchenette that consisted of a microwave and a hot plate. Clothes covered the floor, dishes piled in the sink. But Sienna greeted him with a kiss and said they'd make it work, that this was just temporary until they could afford something better. David set his suitcase down and looked around at the life he'd chosen, and for the first time since he'd sent that first message, he felt a cold tendril of doubt curl around his heart. But he pushed it away. He'd already burned everything down. There was no going back now. He had to believe this was worth it. He had to believe Sienna was his future. Because if she wasn't, then what had he just done? What had he thrown away? 2 days later, he was dead. And the dream he'd chased, the fantasy of starting over with a beautiful young woman who made him feel alive, died with him. Because it had never been real to begin with. It had been a trap, and David Mitchell had walked into it with his eyes wide open, too blinded by desire to see what was waiting for him in the dark. David woke up on the futon with a stiff neck and the smell of stale smoke in his nostrils. Sienna was already awake, scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. She didn't look at him. David sat up slowly, feeling every one of his 34 years in his bones. The apartment looked worse in daylight. The walls were water-stained and yellowing. A crack ran across the ceiling like a lightning bolt frozen in time. The single window faced a brick wall 3 feet away, blocking out most of the natural light. This was his life now. This tiny, suffocating box. He thought about his daughter Emma, probably eating breakfast at the kitchen table right now, asking Claire where Daddy went. The thought made his chest ache. Sienna finally glanced over at him. "You snore," she said flatly. "Like really loud. I barely slept." David apologized, though he'd never snored before in his life, according to Claire. Sienna stood up and stretched, her shirt riding up to expose her flat stomach. She told him she was going to take a shower and walked into the bathroom without closing the door. David heard the water start, heard her singing something off-key. He looked around the apartment trying to find something to do, some way to feel useful. But there was nothing. No coffee maker, no breakfast food in the tiny fridge, just expired yogurt and energy drinks. He checked his phone. 17 missed calls from Claire. 8 voicemails he couldn't bring himself to listen to. A text from his lawyer saying they needed to meet about the divorce paperwork. David's hands shook as he set the phone down. When Sienna came out of the bathroom, her mood had shifted. She was bright and affectionate, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him. "Let's go get breakfast," she said. "Somewhere nice. I want pancakes." David checked his wallet. He had $40 in cash and a credit card that was probably close to maxed out. Claire had already frozen their joint accounts. His next paycheck wouldn't come for another week. But he couldn't tell Sienna that. He couldn't admit that leaving his wife had left him essentially broke. So he smiled and said, "Sure." Pancakes sounded great. They went to a diner downtown where everything cost twice what it should. Sienna ordered the most expensive thing on the menu, eggs Benedict with a side of fruit, orange juice, coffee. David ordered toast and water. When the bill came, it was $53. David's credit card was declined. He tried another one. Also declined. Sienna watched him with an expression he couldn't read. "You said you had money," she said quietly. "You said leaving your wife wouldn't be a problem financially." David felt heat rise in his face. He pulled out his cash and left it all on the table, including what should have been the tip. The waitress would be angry, but he didn't have a choice. On the walk back to the apartment, Sienna was silent. David tried to explain. Claire froze the accounts. "It's temporary. Once we sort out the separation agreement, I'll have access to my salary again. I just need a few weeks." Sienna stopped walking and turned to face him. "A few weeks, David? I can't survive on nothing for a few weeks. I have rent due. I have bills. You told me you'd take care of things." David promised he would. He'd figure it out. He'd borrow from a friend or get a cash advance or something. Sienna studied his face for a long moment, then shrugged. "Okay," she said, "but you need to figure it out fast. I didn't sign up to be poor." The next few days passed in a strange, uncomfortable rhythm. David tried to work remotely from the apartment, taking calls and answering emails while sitting on the futon. But it was almost impossible to concentrate. Sienna played music loudly, talked on the phone for hours, invited friends over without warning. David asked her once if she could keep it down during his work hours, and she snapped at him. "This is my apartment," she said. "I'm not going to be quiet in my own home. You're lucky I'm even letting you stay here." The word stung. He hadn't expected gratitude exactly, but he also hadn't expected hostility. This was supposed to be their fresh start, their love story, but it was starting to feel like something else entirely. Sienna's moods became unpredictable. Some mornings she'd wake up affectionate and playful, calling him baby and making plans for their future. She talked about moving to California, getting an apartment near the beach, starting over where nobody knew them. She said she wanted to have his child someday, a little boy with his eyes. Those moments made David feel like maybe he hadn't made a mistake. Maybe this was just the adjustment period every couple went through. But then her mood would shift without warning. She'd accuse him of not really loving her, of still thinking about his wife. She'd bring up Claire constantly, asking questions David didn't want to answer. Does she know about me? Does she know I'm younger than her? Does she know you picked me? The questions felt like weapons. David started calling Claire late at night when Sienna was asleep. He'd stand outside the apartment building in the cold, phone pressed to his ear, listening to Claire's voicemail greeting. Her voice sounded so familiar, so safe. He wanted to tell her he'd made a mistake, that he wanted to come home. But every time he started to leave a message, the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say that would make any of this okay? So he'd hang up and go back inside, climbing into the futon next to Sienna, feeling more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. His isolation was almost total now. His friends had stopped calling after he left Claire. They'd all taken her side, as he'd known they would. His parents were horrified and had made it clear they wanted nothing to do with his choices. His co-workers whispered about him in the break room. He'd heard through the grapevine that people were calling him pathetic, saying he'd thrown away his family for a teenager and would regret it. David wanted to defend himself, to explain that what he had with Sienna was real, but the words sounded hollow even in his own head. And his daughter. God, his daughter. Claire had blocked him from seeing Emma, said she didn't want their child exposed to his chaos until he got his life together. David had received a letter from Claire's lawyer threatening a restraining order if he showed up at the house unannounced. He was losing everything. And for what? For a girl who couldn't even be bothered to clean her apartment or show him basic kindness half the time. Then Sienna's friends started coming around. The first time it happened, David was working on his laptop when he heard voices in the hallway. The door burst open and 3 people spilled inside, all of them around Sienna's age, loud and chaotic. A girl with pink hair and a nose ring, a guy in a leather jacket covered in patches, another guy with face tattoos and cold, predatory eyes. Sienna greeted them like they were long-lost family, hugging and squealing. She didn't introduce David. He sat on the futon feeling invisible while they blasted music and passed around a bottle of cheap vodka. It wasn't even noon. The guy with the face tattoos eventually noticed David. He walked over and stood too close, looking down at him with an expression of amusement. "You're the dude who left his wife, right? Sienna told us about you." David didn't know what to say. The guy laughed, a sound without warmth. "Bro, that's fucking wild. You really threw away your whole life for this?" He gestured at Sienna, who was dancing with her friends, oblivious. David felt anger rise in his chest, but he swallowed it. He didn't know these people, didn't know what they were capable of. The guy with the tattoos smirked and walked away, but David could feel his eyes on him for the rest of the afternoon. The gatherings became more frequent. Sienna's friends showed up at all hours, turning the tiny apartment into a party space. They did drugs David didn't recognize, white powder and colorful pills, substances they consumed casually like it was nothing. Sienna joined them. David watched her transform into someone he didn't know, someone harder and stranger. She'd laugh too loud, dance too wildly, ignore him completely. When he asked her about the drugs, she told him to relax. "Everyone does this stuff," she said. "Don't be so uptight." But David had never been around this before. He'd smoked weed a few times in college and that was it. This felt different, dangerous. One night, the guy with the face tattoos cornered David in the bathroom. They were both drunk, the apartment packed with people David had never met. The guy leaned against the doorframe blocking David's exit. "What are you even doing here, man?" he asked. "You don't fit. You're like a tourist in our world." David tried to push past him, but the guy didn't move. "Sienna doesn't love you," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "She's using you. We all know it. You're just too stupid to see it." David shoved him then, harder than he meant to, and the guy stumbled back laughing. Sienna appeared in the hallway asking what was going on. "Nothing," the guy said, "just having a conversation." But his eyes stayed on David, cold and knowing. David started losing weight. He wasn't eating properly, couldn't afford to buy groceries, and was too proud to ask Sienna for help. She never offered. She spent money on takeout for herself and her friends, but David was somehow never included. He'd eat the leftovers after everyone left, cold fries and half-eaten burgers, feeling like a scavenger in his own life. His clothes hung loose on his frame. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. He looked sick, haunted. At work, his boss pulled him aside and asked if everything was okay. David lied and said he was fine, just dealing with some personal stuff. The boss looked skeptical but didn't push. David knew he was on thin ice. His performance had tanked. He was missing deadlines, showing up to video calls looking disheveled. How much longer before they fired him? Claire sent him an email. It was the first direct communication they'd had since he'd left. The subject line said, "We need to talk about Emma." David opened it with shaking hands. The email was brief and cold. "Emma has been asking about you. She doesn't understand why you left. I told her you needed time to figure some things out. I didn't tell her about your girlfriend or whatever she is. That's your burden to carry, not hers. If you want to see your daughter, we can arrange supervised visits through a mediator, but you need to get yourself together first. You look terrible in the photos I've seen on social media. People are talking. Our daughter doesn't need to see you like this. Claire." David read the email 5 times. What photos? He didn't post on social media. Then he realized Sienna must have been posting pictures of them together. He checked her Instagram and felt his stomach drop. She'd posted dozens of photos. David in the background of her selfies, looking exhausted and out of place. Photos of them at the diner with captions like "brunch with my man." A photo of him sleeping on the futon with the caption, "He's so cute when he's tired." The comments were brutal. "Who's the old guy? Why does he look homeless?" "Girl, you can do better." David asked Sienna to take the photos down. She refused. "Why?" she said. "Are you ashamed of me?" David tried to explain that it wasn't that. It was just complicated. He had a daughter to think about. Sienna's face hardened. "You left your daughter," she said. "You don't get to use her as an excuse now." The breaking point came on the 6th day. David woke up feeling wrong. His chest was tight. His heart was racing. He couldn't catch his breath. Panic attack, he thought. He'd never had one before. But this must be what it felt like. He tried to stand up, but his legs were weak. The room tilted. He reached for Sienna, but she was passed out next to him, still wearing yesterday's clothes, smelling like alcohol and cigarettes. "David," he said, shaking her shoulder. "Something's wrong. I need help." Sienna groaned and rolled over, not fully waking. "You're fine," she mumbled. "Just go back to sleep." But David wasn't fine. The tightness in his chest was getting worse. His vision was blurring at the edges. He tried to reach for his phone, but his hands weren't working right. Everything felt slow and far away. He thought about Emma, about Claire, about the life he'd destroyed. He thought about how he'd ended up here, on a stained futon in a stranger's apartment, dying or having a breakdown or something in between. And the last thought he had before the darkness pulled him under was this: "I made a mistake. God, I made such a terrible mistake." The ceiling fan spun above him, round and round, hypnotic and endless. Sienna was saying something, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. And then there was nothing, just silence and the dark and the understanding that came too late. That some choices you don't come back from. That some doors, once you walk through them, lock behind you. That David Mitchell had traded everything real for a fantasy, and now the fantasy was killing him. The 911 call came in at 6:42 in the morning. A young female voice, hysterical, barely coherent. "He's not breathing. Oh my God, he's not breathing. I don't know what to do. Please send someone." The dispatcher tried to keep her calm, walking her through CPR instructions, but the girl on the other end just kept screaming. "He's cold. His skin is cold. I think he's dead. I think he's been dead for a while." The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes. The paramedics found David Mitchell's body on the futon, his skin pale and waxy, his lips tinged blue. They checked for a pulse, for any sign of life, but there was nothing. He'd been dead for hours. Time of death was estimated between 2 and 4 in the morning. Sienna Hart sat on the floor in the corner of the apartment, rocking back and forth, her hands covering her face. She kept saying the same thing over and over. "I didn't do anything. I swear I didn't do anything." He just stopped breathing. Detective Torres and her partner arrived shortly after the body was removed. They walked through the apartment slowly, taking in every detail. The garbage overflowing with takeout containers and beer bottles. The clothes scattered across the floor. The smell of decay and neglect that permeated everything. Torres had been a detective for 2 decades, and she'd seen plenty of death, but something about this scene felt wrong. A 34-year-old man didn't just die in his sleep for no reason. Not unless there was something else going on. She found David's wallet on the coffee table. Inside was his driver's license, a photo of a little girl who must be his daughter, and a maxed-out credit card. No cash. Torres looked at the address on the license, Fairfield. A good neighborhood. The kind of place where people had retirement accounts and well-maintained lawns. So what was this man doing here? They brought Sienna down to the station for questioning. She sat in the interview room wrapped in a blanket someone had given her, her mascara smeared down her cheeks. Torres sat across from her and asked her to start from the beginning. How did she know David Mitchell? Sienna's story came out in fragments. They'd met on a dating app. They'd fallen in love. He'd left his wife to be with her. He'd moved into her apartment 6 days ago. Everything was fine, and then last night he said he wasn't feeling well. He'd been complaining about chest pain and trouble breathing. She told him to go to the hospital, but he said he just needed to sleep. When she woke up this morning, he was dead. Torres asked if David had taken any drugs. Sienna hesitated, her eyes darting to the side. "Not that I know of," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Torres pressed. "Was anyone else at the apartment last night? Were there drugs in the apartment?" Sienna's lawyer, a public defender who looked fresh out of law school, told her she didn't have to answer. But Sienna kept talking, the words spilling out like she couldn't hold them back. "Okay, yes, there were people over, my friends. And maybe there were some pills. But David didn't take anything. I would have seen him. I was there the whole time." The autopsy results came back 3 days later and confirmed what Torres had suspected. David Mitchell had died of acute drug toxicity, specifically a lethal combination of oxycodone and alprazolam, opioids, and benzodiazepines. The levels in his system were consistent with someone who had ingested multiple pills, enough to suppress his respiratory system until he simply stopped breathing. The medical examiner ruled it an overdose. But there was a problem. David Mitchell had no history of drug use. His medical records showed no prescriptions for painkillers or anxiety medication. His wife Claire, when interviewed, insisted that David never even took Tylenol unless he absolutely had to. He was terrified of becoming dependent on anything, she'd said. So how did he end up with a fatal dose of drugs in his system? Torres went back to Sienna with the autopsy results. This time, Sienna's story changed. She admitted that yes, there had been drugs at the apartment that night. One of her friends, a guy she knew from around, had brought pills. Sienna said she didn't know what they were, maybe Xanax or something. People took them to relax. David had been stressed, panicking about his wife and his daughter and his job. He'd asked if she had anything to help him calm down, so she'd given him a pill. Just one, maybe two. She couldn't remember exactly, but that was it. She didn't think it would kill him. She thought it would just help him sleep. Torres asked about the friend who'd brought the pills. Sienna said his name was Tyler, or maybe Travis, she wasn't sure. He was just someone who came around sometimes. She didn't have his phone number, didn't know his last name. He was just a guy. Torres had heard this story 1,000 times. The mysterious friend who supplied the drugs and then disappeared like smoke. They pulled surveillance footage from a convenience store near Sienna's building and found images of a man with face tattoos buying cigarettes the night David died. They ran facial recognition but came up empty. No name, no record, no way to track him down. He'd vanished. The investigation expanded. Torres and her team interviewed Sienna's other friends, the ones who'd been at the apartment in the days before David's death. Most of them were barely more than kids themselves, early 20s, living chaotic lives fueled by drugs and poor decisions. They all told similar stories. David had seemed out of place, uncomfortable, like he didn't belong. He'd been drinking heavily, trying to fit in. One girl with pink hair said David had asked her where he could get something to help him relax, that he was having trouble sleeping. She'd pointed him toward the guy with the tattoos. That's all she knew. But then Torres found something that changed the shape of the case. She pulled Sienna Hart's background and discovered a pattern that made her skin crawl. Sienna had been involved with 3 other older men in the past 2 years. Men in their 30s and 40s, all of them married or in serious relationships. All of them had left their partners for her, and all of them had ended up worse off than when they started. The first man, a 42-year-old accountant, had filed for bankruptcy 6 months after moving in with Sienna. The second, a 38-year-old teacher, had lost custody of his children and ended up in rehab. The third had simply disappeared from social media, and his friends reported he'd moved out of state to escape debt collectors. None of them had died, but the pattern was unmistakable. Sienna Hart targeted vulnerable men, isolated them, drained them of resources, and then discarded them. Torres brought this information to the district attorney. They had a problem. Was this a case of involuntary manslaughter, a young woman who'd given her boyfriend drugs without understanding the consequences? Or was it something darker? Had Sienna deliberately given David a lethal dose, knowing it would kill him? The DA wasn't sure they could prove intent. Sienna's story, while suspicious, was consistent. She claimed ignorance. She claimed she'd been trying to help him, not hurt him. And without the mystery man who'd supplied the pills, they couldn't prove where the drugs had come from or who had actually given them to David. They charged Sienna with involuntary manslaughter and distribution of a controlled substance. The trial would hinge on whether a jury believed she'd known the drugs were dangerous. Sienna's defense attorney argued that his client was as much a victim as David Mitchell, that she was a young woman who'd been manipulated by an older man, someone who'd pursued her, love-bombed her, and then moved into her apartment despite her reservations. He painted David as the predator and Sienna as the prey. The prosecution argued the opposite, that Sienna was a con artist who specialized in exploiting middle-aged men going through crises, and that David Mitchell was just her latest victim. The jury would have to decide which story they believed. While the legal system ground forward, Claire Mitchell tried to put her life back together. She'd buried David in a quiet ceremony attended by only a handful of people. His parents, looking broken and ashamed, a few co-workers who felt obligated to show up, Claire's sister, who held her hand through the entire service. No one knew what to say. How do you eulogize a man who'd destroyed his family and died in a stranger's apartment chasing a fantasy? The priest kept the service brief and generic, talking about God's mercy and the mystery of human choices. Claire stood at the grave and felt nothing. Not grief exactly. Not relief either. Just a vast, hollow emptiness. Emma asked about her father constantly. Where's Daddy? When is he coming home? Claire had sat her daughter down and tried to explain in terms a 6-year-old could understand. Daddy made some bad choices, she'd said. He got very sick and the doctors couldn't make him better. So he's in heaven now with the angels. Emma had cried, not understanding, asking why Daddy would choose to leave them. Claire had no answer for that. How could she explain to a child that her father had been so desperate to escape his life that he'd walked away from everything, including her? Some truths were too cruel for a 6-year-old to bear. The house in Fairfield felt like a museum now. Claire walked through rooms that still held traces of David, his coffee mug in the cabinet, his jackets in the closet, the chair at the dining table where he used to sit. She couldn't bring herself to pack his things away, but she couldn't stand to look at them either. Her sister suggested she sell the house, start fresh somewhere new. But Claire couldn't imagine leaving. This was where Emma had grown up, where they'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, where their family had existed before David decided it wasn't enough. The trial happened 6 months after David's death. Claire attended every day, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching Sienna Hart testify. The girl looked younger in person than Claire had imagined, baby-faced and soft-spoken, playing the role of confused victim with practiced ease. She cried on the stand when the prosecutor asked her about the night David died. She said she'd loved him, that she'd never meant for any of this to happen. Claire watched her and felt a complicated tangle of emotions, anger at this girl who'd helped destroy her family, but also a strange sort of pity. Because looking at Sienna, Claire could see the hollowness in her eyes, the performance of it all. This was a person who'd learned to weaponize vulnerability, who'd turned manipulation into survival. And David, lonely and desperate and foolish, had walked right into the trap. The prosecution called Claire to testify. She sat in the witness box and answered questions about her marriage, about David's state of mind in the weeks before he left. She told the truth, that David had been restless and unhappy, that he'd felt trapped by the life they'd built, that he'd been looking for an escape and Sienna had offered him one. The defense attorney tried to twist her words, suggesting that Claire had driven David away with her coldness, her lack of understanding. Claire looked at him with steady eyes and said simply, "My husband made his own choices. I didn't make them for him, and neither did she. David walked away because he wanted to believe in something that wasn't real, and it killed him." The jury deliberated for 2 days. They found Sienna Hart guilty of involuntary manslaughter, but acquitted her of the distribution charge. The judge sentenced her to 6 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3. It felt both like too much and not nearly enough. Sienna showed no emotion when the verdict was read. She simply stood there, blank-faced, as they led her away in handcuffs. Claire watched her go and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no sense of justice served. Just the cold recognition that this wouldn't bring David back, that Emma would still grow up without a father, that the damage was permanent. Afterward, Claire gave a single interview to a local journalist. She sat in her living room, the one she'd shared with David, and talked about what had happened. "People keep asking me how I didn't see the signs," she said. "How I didn't know David was having an affair. But the truth is, you can't see what someone is determined to hide. David wanted something I couldn't give him. Not because I wasn't enough, but because what he wanted didn't exist. He was chasing a fantasy. And when reality couldn't compete with the fantasy, he chose to destroy everything real in his life." The journalist asked if she was angry at David. Claire thought about it for a long time before answering. "I'm angry at what he did to our daughter," she said finally. "Emma deserved better. She deserved a father who stayed. But David himself, I mostly just feel sad for him. He was so convinced that his life wasn't enough, that happiness was somewhere else, with someone else. And he died believing that lie. He died in a stranger's apartment, surrounded by people who didn't care about him, chasing something that was never real to begin with. That's not anger I feel. It's just profound, overwhelming sadness." Years passed. Emma grew older, started asking harder questions about her father. Claire answered them as honestly as she could. She didn't paint David as a villain or a victim. She told Emma that her father had been a regular person who made a terrible mistake, who'd let his fear and unhappiness guide him toward something destructive. She told Emma that loving someone didn't mean defending their worst choices, that you could hold compassion for someone and still acknowledge the harm they'd caused. Claire never dated again. She threw herself into raising Emma, into her work, into building a life that felt stable and safe. She kept one photo of David on the mantle from early in their marriage when they'd both been young and hopeful, not for herself, but for Emma. So her daughter would have something to hold on to, some image of her father before everything fell apart. On the anniversary of David's death, Claire would take Emma to put flowers on his grave. They'd stand there in silence, mother and daughter, looking at the headstone that bore his name and the dates that marked his too short life. Emma would ask the same question every year. "Do you think Daddy's happy now?" And Claire would answer the same way. "I think he's at peace. I think he finally stopped running." The last time Claire thought about Sienna Hart, it was late at night and she was scrolling through old photos on her phone. Pictures of David holding baby Emma. David at their wedding, looking young and nervous and full of promise. David laughing at something, his whole face lit up with joy. Claire wondered if Sienna had ever really loved him, or if he'd just been another mark, another vulnerable man to exploit. She decided it didn't matter. The outcome was the same either way. David Mitchell had left his wife for a 19-year-old girl he barely knew. 2 days later, he was dead. The life he'd imagined with Sienna had never existed. It was a mirage, a shimmer of possibility that disappeared the moment he reached for it. And the truth that haunted Claire, the one she carried with her every single day, was this. David had died believing he was walking towards something better. He died thinking he'd made the right choice, that Sienna represented freedom and youth and a second chance. He never got to understand what he'd really done, that he'd traded everything real and solid and true for a fantasy that only existed in his own desperate imagination. Sometimes the things we think will save us are the very things that destroy us. And sometimes we don't realize we're dying until it's already too late. David Mitchell thought he was starting over. He thought he was finally choosing himself, choosing happiness, choosing life. But what he'd really chosen was an ending, swift and final and utterly preventable. He'd walked away from everyone who truly loved him and died alone on a stained futon in a stranger's apartment. And the saddest part, the part that Claire would never be able to reconcile, was that he'd done it all willingly. No one had forced him. No one had dragged him away from his family. He'd simply decided that the life he had wasn't enough, and that decision, that single catastrophic choice, had cost him everything, including his life.